to our live webcast entitled Determining the ROI of DEI. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nichelle Harrison, and I will be providing features of the web event and presenting the session facilitator as well as the Q&A. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of the web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume setting that you have on the right-hand side of your screen. You will see the Q&A chat window. There is a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the top where you'll type in your questions. To send a question, click in the text box and type your text. When finished, click the Ask button. Your questions will be responded to at the end of the presentation as time permits. We are joined today by our session facilitator, Dr. Janice Gassam, the founder of BWG Business Solutions. She is a TEDx speaker, a Forbes contributor, and her firm, BWG, specializes in helping organizations foster diversity, equity, and inclusion. I invite you to review Dr. Gassam's bio, which can be accessed via the DEI virtual event platform. We are in for a treat today, and we are so grateful to be sharing this space with Dr. Gassam. Take it away at this time.
Thank you so much, Nichelle. I appreciate that lovely intro. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I think that this is a really important topic that we'll be kind of exploring today. So I think that this topic especially is of ever increasing importance, given that a lot of companies are relying on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and are looking to really create more ways to foster this sense of belonging in the workplace. So we're going to explore some of the shifts and changes in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to measure the effectiveness of your programs. Because essentially, I as Nichelle stated, I have a consultancy called BWG, and that stands for Black, White, Green. And it goes to this idea that diversity is not about Black or white, but about green. And when companies put a focus on creating equity, inclusion, and belonging, they will be profitable. So, we're going to really explore and try to understand the ways that you can assess the DEI programs that you include and implement into the workplace. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. Is everyone able to see me? I see a message in the chat box. Is everyone able to? I assume so. Okay, I just saw the message in the chat box. So I'm gonna go ahead and yes, okay, perfect. So, what I was looking at and what I do a lot is one of the things that I do is that I write a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I write articles on things like racism, anti-racism, and I frequently do Google searches, and I look at this really cool tool that Google has called Google Trends. So Google Trends will let you compare different search terms to see how frequently people are searching for these terms. And if you look at words like racism and anti-racism, there was a moderate search trend in Google Trends. And then around June 1st, it skyrocketed. So a lot of people were looking at words like racism. They were also looking at words like diversity. They were looking at words like equity. And there's been an interest and a rise in interest in people wanting to understand and learn more about what it means to foster diversity and anti-racism in the workplace and what that looks like. So I think that the need and the desire to learn more is definitely there. But, there are a few things that are important to think about before deciding to implement a DEI program into the workplace, because a lot of the companies that I've partnered with and that I've worked with have not actually implemented a DEI program into the workplace. So prior to a few months ago, there are many companies out there who didn't have a solid sort of initiative or plan. So this presentation will be really helpful to those companies, but also to people who do have DEI programs that, they don't know if it's actually working or it's effective. They don't know how to measure the effectiveness. So we're going to explore all of those and talk about some do's and some don'ts. So, when I was asked to do this presentation, it was, before all of this year, essentially, it was last year. So pre-COVID, pre the racial revolution of 2020. And, I think that I'm really excited as a practitioner to see more companies really putting a focus on creating a sense of belonging, and leadership really wants to understand, how do we implement systems that ensure that people are being treated fairly, and that they are people of different backgrounds are able to ascend and to be attracted to our organization. So I think that the moment that we're in is has me very hopeful. What has been interesting and what's important to mention is that, as many of you may know, about a month and a half ago, the current administration put restrictions on diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, particularly racial sensitivity trainings that focus on the origins of our country, and put an emphasis on critical race theory and the racist origins of the United States. And government agencies are no longer able to bring people like myself in to conduct these racial sensitivity trainings if the focus is on things like critical race theory, and looking at and unpacking things like white privilege. So that has been an interesting shift. And I think that what I've seen, and even speaking with people who also do this type of work, I've seen that there is some hesitation with companies as far as looking to what leadership in our country is doing. And I think that that does have a trickle down effect. Even for non-government agencies, I think that there is this hesitation as far as and I've heard this narrative of, well, do we really know that these trainings are actually effective? And how do we know that that implementing these programs are actually going to give us an ROI, or a return on our investment? So, I think that there is more hesitance now because of the climate that we're in. But it's very important, again, to look at and to assess maybe some of the current measures that you are currently utilizing, and then talk about some additional ways that maybe you're not yet exploring that are that may be effective in increasing the diversity, equity, and inclusion in your workplace. So when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, if a leadership decides, we want to really put an emphasis and a focus on DEI, what does that usually look like? So, in my experience, companies will call me in. Usually, they already have something in place, they already have a program implemented, or they have nothing. And so I think that the go to has become workshops and trainings. And so companies will maybe see what other organizations are doing, especially after they find themselves in controversial issues. I think a lot of people saw what Starbucks did a few years ago after they found themselves in turmoil, and they did an unconscious bias training. They shut down their stores for several hours and did this training. We've also seen that with Sephora and with Gucci and with all of these, countless companies. And so when we think of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, I think people automatically go to, let's do a training or let's do a workshop. And while trainings and workshops can be very effective, one thing that you have to think about, if this is part of your program, is that how often and how frequently are we actually conducting the trainings? And what I've started to do is to really ask leadership and ask people within the organization what your problem is, because I think training and workshops are often described as the solution, but it's not an effective solution for every single problem that you may have. So you want to think about, for the trainings and the workshops, how often are they being conducted? Who is even conducting them? Because that's also something important to think about. Is it somebody with an expertise in the topic that we're exploring? And oftentimes it's not. Usually there is a person within the workplace. It might be somebody who's part of the human resource department. It might be a diversity manager who is not only directing these programs, but also conducting the trainings as well. So if your go-to is training and workshops, we're going to explore some of the things that you want to really think about. So before you implement or you think about implementing a DEI program, one thing that I recommend to first begin to assess the ROI, the return on the investment, is to come up with a set of objectives and key results. So OKRs are my favorite sort of goal setting method. And essentially, you come up with your diversity objectives or your diversity goals based on your organization's needs and your organizational strategy, and then you come up with very specific metrics and ways to assess those key objectives. So I would say that there are probably three or four very common DEI related issues that most companies have, at least one of these issues. The first is an inability to attract people from different backgrounds into the organization. So this is more of an attraction issue where for whatever reason, there may not be people from different backgrounds who are applying for roles within the company. So therefore, you might call this a pipeline issue. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's not the pipeline, it's the systems and the methods and the strategies that you're actually utilizing to find these candidates that's preventing you from attracting people from different backgrounds. So that's the first, is an inability to attract people from different backgrounds. Another very common issue that I've seen within the workplace is an inability to retain people from different backgrounds. So you might be able to get those people into the company and people from various backgrounds, but they're not staying at the company. And that's something that's really, really important to think about. Another issue that I've seen and that has become more common is microaggressions. So it might be where your company's able to both attract and retain people from different backgrounds, but the culture of the company is toxic, or there is not enough being done to ensure that people from various backgrounds feel a sense of belonging and feel like they're being treated fairly. So that is another common issue. And then in a lot of workplaces, it's some sort of combination of all three of those problems. So it might be where there are a few people from different backgrounds, but they're not ascending in the organization, they're not getting promoted. A lot of companies have issues where there is diversity, but it's mostly junior employees. And as you move up into senior leadership positions, there are not people of different backgrounds represented in those positions. So you have to first understand and try to figure out like what the specific DEI related issue is. And I think that what a lot of companies do is they just look at what Starbucks is doing, or they look at what Sephora is doing, and they're like, you know what, we're going to do an unconscious bias training. And I'm on the fence. I'm 50-50 when it comes to unconscious bias trainings. I do think that in some circumstances they can be effective at increasing people's awareness, but I would say in my experiences they don't typically lead to action. So awareness is not enough, just making people aware that they have biases and blind spots. There has to be systemic change within the company for the organization to see any sort of shifts. So the first thing that you want to do, again, is determine what those objectives and key results are. So essentially, you're figuring out as somebody within the organization, what are our specific issues? Is it that There is a manager that's not fostering belonging among a particular population of employees? Is it specific statements that are being said or things that are being done to people that make them feel othered? Is it that you have quote unquote pipeline issues, like we saw the CEO of Wells Fargo claiming that, that was the reason why there's not a lot of diversity at the company, is that they have pipeline issues where people from different backgrounds are not attracted to or are not in their talent pool. So you have to really think about, and I think that it's important to remember that there's no one size fits all DEI program. What works for Starbucks, even if you're Dunkin' Donuts, might not work for you. It's really contingent on the culture, it's really contingent on your values and your core objectives as an organization. So I think what I see a lot is people reach out to me and they say, "Hey, Janice, we would love for you to do this workshop. We don't know what workshop, but we just want you to do a workshop." And I'll say, "Well, what is your specific issue or what is your objective with doing the workshop?" And they're like, "Well, we know we have issues. We just want to do a workshop." And I think that again, workshops are like the very fast solution. You can get someone, an external vendor such as myself, to do a workshop or have somebody conduct it internally. And it's a very like good face value sort of thing. When you get in trouble, do a workshop. When you have any sort of issues, do an unconscious bias training. But I think that when you're trying to fix these systemic issues, I don't think that workshops alone are going to do that. And especially not one workshop. And a lot of people call me to do one workshop and I explain this to them and they're like, "Well, we still want to bring you in." And I'm like, "Okay, I mean, you can bring me in, you can pay me, but if I'm telling you that this is not going to fix the specific issues, it's important to consider that." So again, there's no one size fits all diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So the first thing you want to do when you establish a DEI program is figure out what your objectives and your key results actually are. So I love this saying of, to measure is to know. You're not going to know how well or how not well you're doing if you're not actually, if you don't have any metrics. So, what are some ways that you can measure the culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workplace? So, one of the ways is, and I think HR has to be, whenever you're doing any sort of DEI work in your organization, your HR department, if you have an HR department, has to work hand in hand with anyone doing and trying to create these DEI programs. So you have to work in tandem with the HR department, because you have to get the numbers. Essentially, it's hard to understand and assess where you're at without looking at those numbers within the workplace. So one thing that I would say, and I would encourage, especially because of everything that's been going on, and employees want to see accountability, is doing like a diversity report. Some companies are starting to get into these where they have a report with different metrics related to the organization and related to DEI, and they share that report either with the public or internally with employees in the organization. So, we've seen a lot of the tech companies that we are familiar with, such as the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks and the Microsofts, since 2015, they've all been putting out their diversity report. So if you go on Google right now and search Apple 2015 diversity report, you'll see the diversity reports for the last 6 years. I don't know if they've come out with 2020 yet. They may have. So for the last 6 years, you'll see diversity reports from these large tech companies. And I think that this is a great step in the right direction as far as a transparency purpose. But what I think they miss in these reports, and what I think your company can learn from, is if you've ever looked at any of these reports, they have the numbers, they have how many people from all of these backgrounds are represented, how many veterans do we have, how many people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, how many women do we have, how many men do we have, how many people from the LGBTQIA plus community do we have. So they have a lot of different metrics that they assess. And so you can see how many people currently in the company are in senior leadership positions, how many. They look at also intersectionality as far as how many women of color are in senior leadership positions. But one of my main qualms with these diversity reports, and maybe in 2021 they'll change this, is that they don't show you the number of people that actually stayed in these positions over time. I think it looks good to say 40% of our population is women, but I would be really curious to know how many of those women stayed from 2019 to 2020, because I think especially in the tech industry, there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of turnover. There's kind of like this bro culture in many industries in corporate America, where people from different backgrounds are feel shut out and do not feel fully included. So I think that when you're assessing DEI and the DEI efforts that your company is engaged in, you want to think about also assessing retention, but as far as over the years, not just looking at a snapshot. And I think that that's where a lot of these companies, these tech companies, get it wrong, is that they look at the snapshot without looking at the full picture. So when you're assessing the return on your investment of your diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, the first thing that you want to think about when you've created these objectives and key results, you have to first then define what diversity, equity, and inclusion means to your organization. So I think that this is where a lot of leadership messes up, is that it's everyone sees it, a lot of people see it as a conglomerate, where it's just like, oh, diversity, inclusion, equity, they're all kind of the same thing, and they're not. And I think that that's where a lot of companies drop the ball, is assuming that these things are all the same. So it's also important to remember that it looks different to different companies. So what does diversity look like to your company? Does it mean we don't have a lot of female representation, so we need more female representation? Does it mean we have no Black employees, so we need more Black employees? What does diversity mean? And diversity, as I'm sure we all know, is the amount of, you can think about it as the amount of people from various backgrounds within your organization. Does your organization have people from various backgrounds? And if you don't have people from various backgrounds, that's where you would start to create these objectives and key results and say, well, our objective is to get more representation from these underrepresented groups. So we realize we don't have a lot of people from the Black or Latinx community. So that's our objective, is to increase representation. How are we measuring that? So diversity, I think, is one of the easier aspects of DEI to measure, because it's easy to look at the company and visibly see if there are people from different backgrounds within the organization. So then you have to think about, as far as inclusion, how are you defining inclusion? And I think that this is where, again, companies get really tripped up, because we're assuming that diversity, equity, and inclusion are all the same thing. And there is an assumption a lot in corporate America that the buck stops at diversity. So the only goal is we need more diverse representation. And then once you get those people from different backgrounds into the company, then it stops. So if anything is important, it's not only diversity, but it's inclusion, and then the equity piece. So how are you or what are you doing to ensure that people from various backgrounds in the organization feel a sense of value? What are you doing to ensure that? And I don't think enough leaders are asking themselves that question. And not just, and I want to just point out also, it's not just leaders. I think that there has to be a shift from thinking that DEI is the responsibility of one person. Maybe it's leadership, maybe it's the chief diversity officer, and realizing that it's everyone's responsibility. It's not the manager's responsibility to ensure that me and my coworker are treating each other with value. It's essentially our responsibility to ensure that we're doing that. So I think that there has to be a recognition that DEI is everyone's responsibility. We can't shift the blame and say, well, that's this person's job, or that's this person's job. All of us are contributing to the culture of inclusion or exclusion within the workplace. So thinking about, how are we conceptualizing inclusion? What does that mean to our company? What does that mean to us? It may have been that there was an incident that happened, for example, where someone expressed that they didn't feel included, or that something was done to make them feel excluded. And oftentimes when we see DEI efforts being implemented, it's sometimes because of, or oftentimes rather, because of this inclusion piece. Something happened where someone did not feel included, whether it was a microaggression that was frequent enough to be escalated to another level, whether it was something that was said or done that was more blatant to a person from an underrepresented background or from an underrepresented group. But the inclusion piece is so important. And I was having a conversation with a close friend of mine who also does the DEI work. And he was saying that what he finds really problematic in these companies is that they want to hire a chief diversity officer or a diversity head, but they provide them with no support. And I think that that's also where you fail. If you have an inclusion issue, especially, it's not enough to bring one person in to fix the problem of inclusion. One person, especially at a large company with more than 100 people, one person is not going to fix your culture of exclusion. So you have to really give the person the tools, and that could be through a diversity task force, which research has indicated is a really effective way to foster DEI in the workplaces, through a task force, through the support of HR. That might be through a position with the executives. So you have to figure out, if you have a chief diversity officer or a diversity manager, how you're supporting them, what tools are being given to them to ensure that they are able to actually accomplish their goals. Because again, sometimes what happens is you put one person in a position and you set them up to fail. And then when things don't work out, you have a scapegoat and you have a person to say, well, see, look, this didn't, we weren't able to shift the culture. It's this person's fault. And it gives you a person to blame. But I think that what a lot of companies need to do is make sure that you're giving that person the resources and the help to actually accomplish these goals that you set out to reach. So you have to think about, what does inclusion mean to our company? What does that look like in our particular organization? And that changes depending on what the organization is and what the organization does. And then the last piece is the equity piece. And again, I think that equity is like the forgotten aspect, because it's not only enough to have people from different backgrounds represented in the organization, and then make sure that they feel good and that they feel valued. You need to also be treating them fairly. And I think, again, that when you think about equity, you have to ask yourself, what does treating people fairly look like in our organization? Well, it looks like paying people equitably to do the same work. It looks like, again, making sure that people from different backgrounds have an equal opportunity to advance within the organization. Because what happens often is that you see an organization and the leadership says, well, we have lots of diversity in this company, and it's mostly junior representation. And then as you go up to senior leadership, there's less and less people from different backgrounds represented. So looking at the equity piece of, do we have structures and systems in place where people have an equal chance of ascending within the organization? Do we have the policies and practices that allow people to thrive and to be successful in this organization? Are we giving everyone the same opportunities? That's very important. And then also with the equity piece, it's recognizing that some people have been historically disadvantaged. So recognizing that and providing opportunities so that everyone can be at the same level. I think that that's really important. That's, if you see that somebody needs an accommodation, for example, providing them with those accommodations is to ensure that you're treating everyone fairly, because everyone's circumstances are unique. So you have to think about, as an organization, what diversity means to you, what equity means to you, and what inclusion means to you, how you're conceptualizing that. And if you have different definitions of what it is, also looking at how you're structuring and building these objectives and key results. So if one of your objectives is to foster inclusion, which I think every company, that's the goal. One of the goals is to foster an inclusive organization. What does that look like? How does that manifest? And so that's what we're going to talk about, because I think that a lot of people have difficulty conceptualizing the equity and inclusion piece, especially the inclusion piece, because it's not always something that's visible, and that's tangible, and that you can readily is available. So I think that that's important to assess and to explore some of the ways that you can measure each of these different aspects. So when it comes to DEI metrics, I think that again, having those objectives and key results, and defining what diversity, what equity, and what inclusion mean in your workplace are the first steps and are very important. But then you have to think about, once you've figured out like what is our problem, and let's say your problem is, let's say it's all three. It's that you're unable to attract people from different backgrounds, you're unable to retain them in the workplace, and that you have microaggressions that permeate your workplace, let's just say. So you have to think about, if those are your three problems, then you have to think about what sorts of interventions can we introduce to mitigate these issues. And again, I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that one very common and popular solution, or resolution rather, is diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And I think that if when it comes to microaggressions, I think that training is a very effective way to start to resolve the issue, because many times when it comes to people engaging in microaggressive behaviors, part of it comes from a lack of understanding and awareness. People don't know always that what the activities that they're engaging in are being perceived in a certain way by the person on the receiving end. So the workshops and trainings provide that education piece that I think is really, really integral to being able to foster a culture of understanding and inclusion. So workshops and trainings is one way to go. Also, I think when you're trying to initially assess the culture of inclusion, surveys can be a good way to do that. But again, with the problem with surveys is that sometimes you don't have a high response rate. And typically, it tends to be people who have very, very negative experiences or very positive experiences. And more, there is a bias in that people are more likely to share and write about, even when you go online and you look at these review websites, people are more likely to share their negative experiences with something than they are to share their positive experiences. I don't think I've ever gone on a website like Yelp and put in a positive review of an experience I had, even though I've gone to restaurants and maybe really enjoyed them. But if I've had a really, really negative experience, there are a few times that I've gone online and written a review so that other people know, like, this was my experience with this organization or with this company. Or so I think with surveys, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but it's a good starting point, especially when you're looking to assess inclusion and belonging. Anonymous surveys can give you a good understanding of that. But you also want to think about other programs such as mentorship or sponsorship programs. And if your DEI issue is that you're unable to retain people from various backgrounds, mentorship and sponsorship programs are some of the best interventions to help you to resolve that issue. So the Center for Talent Innovation, which is now, I think they've modified their name and they're called COQUAL. They came out with a report at the end of 2019 called The State of Black Employees, or The State of Black America. And they surveyed a large portion of Black employees in different corporate positions to look for trends. And one of the things that they found in the research was that 1 in 5 employees that were surveyed said that Black employees that were surveyed said that they did not feel like they had access to leadership. So I think that when you look at, particularly when it comes to different underrepresentations of racial and ethnic groups, thinking about mentorship and sponsorship programs can be a really effective intervention. And also, when it comes to women and women's advancement in the workplace, a lot of research has indicated that mentorship programs, but more so sponsorship programs, can be a really effective way to foster that advancement and really propel a woman's career. So you have to think about, how do we, implement these programs? So workshops and trainings, mentorship programs, how do we implement those? And mentorship programs are a little bit more feasible sometimes to implement because it's usually you're pairing a junior and a senior level employee together, and the mentor is providing guidance for the mentee. It's a little bit more hands off, the mentorship program. A sponsorship program, on the other hand, is where someone is taking a vested interest in the person that they're sponsoring, where they are advocating for you in different ways and really instrumental in propelling your career. The problem with mentorship and sponsorship programs is that sometimes it can be difficult to incentivize people to want to be a mentor or a sponsor. So I think that that's just a hurdle that you have to think about. How do we incentivize people to want to participate? There might be lots of people who want mentorship, but not enough people to be mentors. So also what I've seen companies doing as far as interventions a lot lately is something called listening sessions, where following the killing of George Floyd, a lot of companies have said, well, we recognize that for a long time we've stifled the voices of our employees of color, but more specifically our Black employees. So what we want to do is create a system so that we're able to listen to our Black employees and their experiences, and we're also able to share our perspectives and our experiences. So I think that listening sessions can also be a good way when you talk about inclusion and belonging. Listening sessions can be a really good way to foster that sense of inclusion that may not have been felt or present. So some additional DEI metrics that you want to consider and to think about. So the first we've talked about is hiring rates. And I think that typically companies look at hiring, how many people are represented in the company. It's one of the most easily or readily available diversity metrics that companies look at. So the amount of people from different backgrounds entering the organization. Also, the attrition rate, how many people from different backgrounds are leaving the organization. And I think that it's important to look at trends. Are there a lot of employees from a particular background that are not staying past a year? And again, when I talked about the tech diversity report, that's one of the issues that I had, is that we're not seeing the attrition rates over the years. They're not showing us. They're showing us the amount of diverse representation in that moment, which it might look good. It might be, wow, 40% of our population is women or is people from underrepresented racial backgrounds. But the next year, all of those people have quit and now there's a new set of individuals. So I think that looking at attrition rates and across the different groups is also an important metric to assess and to look at every year to see if you notice any trends. And you might see, oh, why is it that women are leaving at a higher rate in these leadership positions than men, for example. Another metric that you want to think about is within the HR department, looking at the feedback and the complaints. Have there been a rise in DEI related complaints that are shared by employees? Are employees complaining about a persistent issue related to diversity, equity, or inclusion? It might be employees complaining that they don't feel like they have opportunities to ascend in the workplace, or that they've been treated unfairly by a particular manager. So has there been a rise in these sorts of, because as an HR department, you should be taking a record of these things, and there should be some sort of record of like the complaints that people come to make within the HR department. So looking at, has there been a shift in these complaints? Have they increased? Have they decreased? Which is after you introduce an intervention like training, for example, you can assess whether these complaints related to DEI have increased or have decreased. You can also assess employee feedback. And, we talked about surveys, but also looking at informal feedback. What is being said to managers? What is being said if your company has a Slack channel? What is being said in the Slack groups, and taking that information and that feedback? Some companies that I've worked with have a DEI Slack channel. So asking those employees if there is, if they've noticed any sorts of trends. If your company has an employee resource group, which if not, one of the best ways to foster inclusion within the workplace is to implement an employee resource group, which is just a group of employees who have shared characteristics. So it might be um, those who experience mental illnesses and those who have family members who've experienced mental illnesses. And they have a group where they meet regularly and just discuss strategies for coping with whatever their different experiences are. So it could be, you ask your employee resource group for feedback about the culture of inclusion for that particular population. It could be asking different employee resource groups, or asking if your company has a diversity task force. But feedback is so vital and is so critical when you're trying to assess and to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion. You need to be frequently having these conversations. And even in a listening session, if you decide to implement a listening session every month, what is the feedback in that listening session? What is the feedback after the listening session? And I think looking at and taking perceptions before the listening session or before the workshop or the intervention, and then afterwards. So feedback is a really effective metric that can tell you or give you a snapshot of what's really going on as far as your culture of DEI within the workplace. Also, one metric that I think a lot of companies miss or don't look at is exit interview data. When people are leaving the organization, that's usually when they're the most candid, and when they're going to tell you how they feel. They're going to tell you, they'll really share their feelings. So looking at exit interview data, what someone has said, there should be some notes that are taken when someone is in an exit interview and they're giving feedback. So the exit interview data that is shared with the HR department, or the feedback that's given in a resignation letter. So things like that should also be assessed and can give you an understanding of the culture of inclusion or exclusion, or the lack of equity within the organization. Also looking at public awards and recognition. Sometimes companies make the best diverse companies to work for list, but also receiving awards and public recognition can indicate the culture of DEI that's being created within the organization. And I think that looking at, if the issue, for example, is a lack of diversity, or that there are all of these diversity issues that are rampant, you could look at, did we hire somebody to come in and help us with these particular issues? And did we create a task force, or do we create a diversity committee of people who are really committed to the issue that can help? And the introduction of these positions in your company is also a metric that you can look at, because it is a step in the right direction if you hire a chief diversity officer, or you hire a chief belonging officer, which some companies have. So looking at that, and again, like we talked about, the number of complaints in HR related to different DEI issues, whether it's an increase or a decrease in people complaining about microaggression. So looking at those are some ways that you can assess the DEI within your organization. So I think that also what's important to mention, and I've been discussing how I think companies confuse the D, the E, and the I, and they assume that it's all the same, or they really assume if you have diversity, you have all of the other factors. You're fostering belonging, you have inclusion, you have equity. But again, I think the diversity is not enough. And if you're not creating systems so that people feel valued and people feel included and people feel respected, then you're setting those employees up to fail. And what you'll see is that you'll have high attrition, and you'll see people from different backgrounds who are leaving the organization because the company's not doing enough to make people feel a sense of value and to feel a sense of inclusion. So again, also, I want to say that I always say if you talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. I think a lot of employees right now in this moment that we found ourselves in are holding their company's proverbial feet to the fire. And they're really saying, you have to, you posted a black square in June, but you're not doing anything to make sure you're actually hiring people from various backgrounds. You said that you signed a diversity pledge, but what have you actually done to make sure that the systems within the organization are equitable? So when you talk about equity, as far as systems, there are several places you want to make sure that you look within the organization. So I think that pay is a huge issue. You want to make sure that you're paying people equitably. You want to make sure that there's pay parity. So to assess that, you could do a pay audit. A lot of companies within the HR department do this, where they compare the salaries of people who are doing comparable things, who live in maybe different parts of the country, to see if they're getting paid equitably. Some companies have also done transparent salaries, which you may want to think about, where it's accessible to see how much everyone in the organization makes. And if you work in federal agencies or state agencies, this information is available already on websites where you have pay grades. But you might want to think about transparent salaries as a way to foster equity. So you want to look at making sure that people are getting paid fairly. Also, you want to make sure that and consistently conduct audits for your performance reviews and performance evaluations, because you have to audit that system and audit that process of performance evaluations. And I think a lot of companies have these systems that are being done without really thinking about whether they're actually equitable and they're fostering inclusion, and that they're not treating different people or disadvantaging different groups and different types of people. So again, when you're thinking about and trying to implement a DEI program into the workplace, some things you want to think about, just to review, is you want to first understand what your specific DEI issues are. So you want to think about what are our issues. Once you've figured out the issues, then you want to develop some objectives and key results. So if your issue is a lack of diverse representation, be specific with what that is or what that means. Is it we want more women, we want more people of color, we want more specific ethnicities? And then what is the metric? How are you assessing that? Is it the percentage of new people in that group that come into your organization within the next year? Is it like, what is the metrics for that? And then you want to think about some of the metrics that we've discussed, as far as assessing exit interviews, doing pay audits, doing performance review and evaluation audits, looking at feedback, employee feedback, and doing surveys as well to assess the culture of inclusion or exclusion. So that concludes my discussion on okay, there we go. That includes my discussion on how to determine the ROI of your diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my lovely co-host, Nichelle, to start or facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Gassam. You provided so much great information there. We do have some questions, so I'm glad we have a few minutes to get to some of those questions. I think one of the first ones I want to jump into: if values and core objectives are stated at the top of the house, but doesn't trickle down to local markets or regions, how do you systemically change that market in a middle management position as a minority?
That's a great question. I think that when you get buy-in from leadership, I always say everything trickles down from the top. So I think if you're in the middle of the organization. There is strength in numbers. So if there's other middle managers that you can sort of come together with to try to create this systemic change, there is power in that if it's not just you yourself, but if you're able to come together. And then also, I think showing the value, people really want to know, like, what's in it for me? What am I going to get from this? So I think that if you're able to show that, and there's so many at this point, I think people should know, like, there's so many, so much research that indicates the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what sorts of how that increases your profitability. So I think that being able to maybe establish that relationship with other middle managers who may be in the same position and coming together and saying, as a manager, we've noticed these particular things that we need to see changes in these areas. I think that when you come together, that can really get notice of leadership within the organization, especially now. I've seen, yeah, sure. I've seen um I've seen a lot of changes happening now within companies because I think that people are more open and feel more comfortable and more empowered to speak out and speak up about these things. So I also think that is like just the environment that we're in now is the time to really vocalize the issues that you may be having or the concerns that you may have when it comes to DEI.
Thank you for that. That's right. There is value in numbers. So I want to ask you, how do you feel COVID will impact metrics? Because you talked a lot about metrics and measuring things. How do you feel COVID will impact metrics? And will the impact be long term? Should we consider implementing new metrics?
Mhm. I think that's a great question. I think that all of these metrics actually are still implementable or are still, you can use them even with COVID. I think that exit interviews are still being conducted unless it's like mass layoffs. Then it's more challenging. But as far as surveys, I've actually seen companies introduce more metrics because of COVID and because of the era that we're in. And people are like, I have no idea what our diversity climate is like. What should we do? So I think that that a lot of these metrics you can still use to assess. You're really just trying to understand the employees, and I think that with more people being at home and working remote, there may be a higher response rate when it comes to surveys and things like that. So I do think that now is a good time to still, you can still use these metrics to assess the culture and the climate. I think that what I've seen with COVID is, to be honest, in April, I think that there was a decrease in interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then in June, there was an increase. So I was scheduled to do a number of workshops and trainings and consulting with companies. And in April, all of them were canceled. So I think that what happened was companies thought that it wasn't a priority and they put it on the back burner and they said, we don't have money for this. We've lost a lot of money. So we're not thinking about inclusion. Who cares? We're trying to save our butts. We're trying to save money. And then the racial revolution happened, and people were like, oh my gosh, we really cannot afford, literally, we cannot afford as a company to not be talking about these things. So I think that this was really a wake up call for a lot of organizations. So I think that companies are now, and more platforms are popping up to actually measure different aspects of DEI. So I think that in the future, because of what's happening right now, there will actually be more metrics, and I don't think COVID will impact our ability to assess and to look at and use some of these metrics.
COVID has highlighted these metrics, and
Yeah.
that they're still universal. A lot of them can still be applied. So we have another question. I think we have time for a couple of more. This one comes from Howard. Howard says, I am not in HR, so I don't know all the rules, but if we wanted to create our first ever diversity report to be held accountable for future progress, what categories are the best and allowable to measure?
That's a great question. I could tell you what I would recommend, but I would also ask employees and see what they want. I think they're always curious to see the numbers, especially if it's a large company. But I think they also want to know if there's any trends as far as how people are responding when it comes to answering questions like, my company makes me feel a sense of belonging, on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 of strongly agree to strongly disagree. Are there certain trends that when you evaluate the results of the survey that you're seeing where more women are answering that their company does foster belonging, or more women from a particular background are responding in one way versus others? So I think that looking at developing a set of questions around different areas, whether that's um, disagree or agree. I am paid equitably at my company. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. So I think asking those questions can get at the equity. But also, I think people just are interested in seeing the numbers, especially at a company over 100. You kind of just know the people in your department. You might not know what's going on within the organization. So I would say just those numbers as far as like how many people from different backgrounds are represented. But for some groups, people may feel more comfortable or less comfortable disclosing. Like when it comes to if you're a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, you might not want to disclose that, or you might not feel comfortable disclosing it. So I think that there are some metrics that are more readily available and HR can provide, such as a person's race and their gender. But some of these other metrics, you may not be able to readily assess. And you may see trends as far as even generational differences, where you might have a department that's primarily Gen Z, and then another department that is baby boomers. And you might see that there are differences in perception and pay equity, or perceptions of pay equity in these different groups. So I think that asking questions that get at some of these more some of these topics people are wanting to know more would be interesting and would be good to share. But I would encourage you also, if you want inspiration, to just Google, because they're all available online through an online search. If you just look at Microsoft Diversity Report, you'll see for the last 5 to 6 years the diversity reports, and you can see what they looked at and what they assessed, like how many people are in leadership positions based on gender, based on race and ethnicity, based on, I'm not sure if they did age. But looking at all of those things, and then also looking at like those questions and how people answered them as far as inclusion and equity.
Thank you. What you did in one question, you answered about 3 or 4 questions that we had. So I was constantly looking over to see what other questions you have. So I do want to get one more in, something that I think, because we hit on this earlier and then we've been talking about it a lot today. From a microaggression slash DEI training standpoint, do you believe it should be mandatory or an opt-in or opt-out type of scenario?
For training and workshops.
Yeah, for training and workshops within an organization, should it be
Oh,
mandatory?
that's a great question. Based on the research, there's lots of research on this that says DEI training should not be mandatory. So I always preface this. I tell companies, and they always, I think leadership wants to make it mandatory because they want to feel like everyone's participating. But again, that can cause backlash and resistance. So I would say never make it mandatory, just based on the research. But I would strongly encourage people to attend. And I also, one tip that I would give you is don't even call it a diversity training. People have a certain perception when they hear diversity in particular. So I would use certain words like, this is a leadership training, where when you get there, we're focusing on microaggressions. But if I tell you it's a microaggression training, I've already kind of primed you and maybe you don't want to attend. So I think that you have to kind of be creative as well, because you can't, or you should not force people to attend. But you do want to entice people to want to attend.
Sometimes it's all in the way we word things, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
we are almost out of time here. So I do want to say, on behalf of Greenville Chamber's 4th Annual DEI Summit and presenting sponsor Michelin North America, I would like to thank Dr. Gassam for her time today. And I want to thank all of you for your participation in this event. If you did not get the opportunity to have your question answered here, you can connect with Dr. Gassam. Her information is in the speaker bio section. At this time, you may log out and transition to the next segment of today. Per your agenda, this concludes our session, and thank you and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.